Good evening and welcome to a conversation that we are having this night with Ana Oliveira and Pedro Naguera. I appreciate everyone joining us for a conversation about COVID, about education, about racial justice, and about a way forward. We've been holding these conversations at Brotherhood Sister Soul since the advent of COVID. We've been holding conversations that are an exchange of ideas, that are an attempt to really struggle with the issues of this day. In this time of social distancing and this time where it's so difficult to find community, we believe that this series, and this is the fifth that we've had since the advent of COVID, these curated conversations are so important to building community, to building connection, to advancing ideas. We've also held conversations about our community plaza and about art and about youth-focused town halls, so different ways to engage voices. And this evening, we engage with two leading national conversationalists, experts, social justice advocates in the United States. And so I'm very pleased that they are joining me. My name is Kari Lazar-White, and I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Brotherhood Sister Soul. And the Brotherhood Sister Soul is a comprehensive social justice nonprofit. We are a youth development organization that's been around for 25 years. We work in 3 different spaces. We provide comprehensive wraparound supports to young people from 8 until 22, everything from international study in Africa and Latin America to after-school programming, arts-based programming, environmental education, all of it though through a lens of understanding the critical political issues of our time, issues of race and of gender, issues of identity, issues of who our young people are so that they can understand the conditions that they face and become social change makers. What we aspire to do is to do the work of SNCC, to be a youth development organization that helps young people to take their rightful place, leading now, advocating now, seeking change now. And so the first piece of what we do is that comprehensive youth development. The second is that we've trained now over 3,000 educators across the nation on our model from nearly 300 organizations, some as far as Brazil and Bermuda, many right here in New York City, trying to spread the model of what we do, of a youth-focused, youth-centric, youth development approach. And the third area that we work in, very aligned with what we're talking about this evening, are about the social justice conditions that we face as a community. We want to change conditions around economic inequality, around educational inequality, around inequality that's rife throughout the criminal justice system, as it's called. These are the issues we work on so that our young people don't have to face the kind of realities that they face every single day. Right now, we begin this conversation in the midst of 2 pandemics, as I frame it. One pandemic, of course, being the COVID pandemic and its disproportionate effect on Black and Latinx and Native peoples. The second being the pandemic that's been here since the founding of our nation, that of systemic racism. They intersect in so many ways. And tonight we'll talk about many of those ways. But Brotherhood Sister Soul has also had to respond in new ways because of COVID. Because of the closing of our schools for such a long period of time, because of the loss of jobs in this city, we had to provide over 150 computers for our young people and hotspots so that they could access the online learning that they were told to access, many of them not having that in their home or sharing one computer with multiple family members. We've had to expand our mental health support to help young people deal with the trauma that they're facing every single day. All of us are facing trauma due to this time. Pedro and I were talking earlier, and he said, this is a tough time. This is a tough time for everybody. But obviously, young people need additional supports to navigate and to understand. And so we've expanded our mental health support. We've also provided over $75,000 in emergency financial support, helping with crucial bills and critical payments, from keeping phones on and lights on and paying Con Ed, to pharmacy bills and hygiene products and food on the table. One of the things that our young people have said they've been most in need of is food. We know that nearly 40% of all pantries in New York have closed during this time. Brotherhood Sister Soul always provided food in the kind of normal day-to-day work of youth development, providing breakfast and lunch as we fed and supported. You can't educate young people's brains if you're not feeding their bellies. So that's always been a part of what we do. But when we closed our doors initially in March, and now through today having reopened, the reality was that so many of our young people needed access to food. And so we stepped up, as our organization always does. And since March, the Brotherhood Sister Soul has provided over 250,000 meals to our young people in our community, 250,000 meals. And we do this every Wednesday, taking care of our community, taking care of our young people. And, you know, when you speak to the issue of systemic racism, this has been the work of Brotherhood Sister Soul since our founding. We are an anti-racist organization founded 25 years ago that has always brought a fierce analysis of gender, of deconstructing misogyny and sexism, and of class and economic inequality into our analysis of how we will deconstruct racism and struggle against it. It's always been what we do. This summer, we released a film called Legacy, which details 25 years of our work to push back against and counter systemic racism in its many forms. And so these conversations are in continuance of that. And when I thought about who could join me tonight in this conversation, you know, I jumped to the top of my list, Pedro Naguera and Ana Oliveira. They are friends and colleagues. We've known each other a long time. We hope that you'll feel informed and engaged, that you'll feel moved to reflect and moved to action this evening. First, Ana Oliveira, a native of Brazil. She is the president and CEO of the New York Women's Foundation, the largest women's fund in the country. Since 2006, she has led an increase in the foundation's annual grant making from nearly $2 million a year to over $6 million today. She focuses on economic security, safety, and health. And for over 29 years, the foundation has distributed over $50 million to over 370 organizations, impacting over 6 million women and girls in poverty across New York City. The New York Women's Foundation has also cultivated critical partnerships, influencing policy changes in equal pay and financial investments, focusing on areas of social and economic inequity for women's and families. In the past, Ana has served as a member of the New York City HIV Planning Council, the New York City Commission on AIDS, and chaired the New York City Commission for LGBTQ runaway and homeless youth, and also co-chaired Mayor Bloomberg's Young Men's Initiative. Throughout her career, she's been a leader on issues of substance abuse, HIV/AIDS, and incarceration, and really a voice for careful, involved, committed, social justice-focused philanthropy, which is very, very rare to find. Prior to joining the New York Women's Foundation, she was the executive director of the Gay Men's Health Crisis. She's been a longtime advocate of the work of Brotherhood Sister Soul, one of our longest funders, and she received the June Jordan Clarion Call Award from Bro Sis at our annual Voices Gala some years ago. Welcome, Ana.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pedro Naguera is one of the leading voices on education in the country. He is a sociologist, a researcher, and a former public school teacher. His scholarship and research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global context. He's currently the Dean of the School of Education at the University of Southern California, and he has previously been a professor and run educational research institutes at UCLA, where he led the Center for Transformation of Schools, UC Berkeley, where he was the director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change, and NYU, where he was the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. And he's also taught at Harvard as well. He was the trustee of the SUNY system from 2009 to 2012, and is currently a special advisor to the governor of New Mexico, as well as departments of education for the states of Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. He's the co-author or author of 13 books, speaks throughout the nation on national media sites about education and race. And in 2020, he was elected to the American Academy for the Arts and Sciences. Pedro is a longtime member of the board of directors of the Brotherhood Sister Soul. Welcome, Pedro.
Thanks, Gar.
So first this evening, I'd like us to talk about the COVID pandemic from a national perspective. Obviously, this is a time of incredible upheaval, and yet it's had disproportionate effects on Black and Latinx and Native communities. And so, I'm wondering if you can talk some about the unique realities and disparate impacts that are faced by these low-income young people, by the Black and Latinx and Indigenous community. But as you speak about it, we know that these massive, deep-seated, widespread inequalities existed pre-COVID. So it's kind of like, what did the pandemic further reveal that was already here? Anna, you wrote recently, we're going to be dealing with a devastating additional legacy now because of COVID. That legacy is opening bigger wounds in the pre-existing wounds of unabashed racism and racial disparities and economic inequality, and an enormous continuation of a gender ranking in our society. Anna, can you speak to this?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for having me in this terrific conversation. What a inspiring for me and opportunity to talk with you and Pedro in the times that we're in. That's exactly what I think we need to do. So thank you again. So, sometimes I like to use the analogy of, we're talking about COVID, which is a virus, and viruses tend to be much more effective in low immune systems, in vulnerable bodies with low immunity. And in our case, I think that what we see is that what this health condition has done is also showed us the social low immunity, the existence of disparities, as we know, but it has, it's like a beam of light that has, it's been shining through all the, I'm gonna say the comfortability, the somewhat, oh yeah, I know there's economic inequality. Oh yeah, I know there's racism. Oh yes, we understand that gender, oppression exists. And a kind of an easiness, or the word easiness is a hard word, but with the material affluence that exists in some parts of this country to some classes in this country, and the marketing, this economy of consumption and this cultural suppression reality that we live here, what this pandemic has done, it has been thriving in the inequalities, in the racial inequalities, in the gender inequalities, in the economic inequalities, in the immigration inequalities, in the aging inequalities. I mean, the glaring stark inequities have created a condition for this pandemic to exist the way it exists here. I firmly believe that in addition of thriving in inequality, thriving in injustice, the handling of it, the kind of carelessness as a benign word that has existed, certainly at the national level, since we are in the national moment of this conversation, it is part of that inequality. It is part of the message of dispensable lives, So Black lives, Black and brown lives, Native communities' lives have been dying at more than 3 times Caucasian lives, have been our communities are being decimated in some ways by the pre-existing conditions and the additional carelessness that has been going on. So I would think, we would hope that the response would be a response of defense, a response of protection, but the response hasn't been that response. Right. And because health disparities, racial disparities, and economic disparities are also a reflection of political power disparities, then we have very little ability to turn around fast what could be an opportunity to deal with these disparities. So instead has gone deeper. But I would say that every crisis is an opportunity. And as one says, we should never waste a crisis, right? That means we should seize all the opportunities, which I hope we'll talk a little later about it. But on a national scene, you know, I'm going to say this. It is phenomenal. It is outstanding, the level of carelessness and the level of, I think, you know, direct neglect and direct ranking of lives that truly don't matter. And those are Black lives, brown lives, indigenous lives, immigrants' lives, right? Of all descents.
That's right. So Pedro, on picking up on this, you wrote an op-ed recently where you said, quote, as many as 1 in 5 of California's 6 million children lack either internet access or appropriate devices for distance learning. A recent study from USC estimated that in communities such as Watts and Compton, 50% of children have no access to the internet at all. The same study found that among the poorest households, only about half are able to participate in distance learning. And in a recent New York Times article that featured a conversation between you and Obama's Secretary of Education, John King, and Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, you said, quote, the inequity of the situation is compounded over and over again, and we're going to see the consequences of this for many years to come. So can you speak to this, to these unique realities and disparate impacts, obviously with a specific focus on education, but as a sociologist, you know, broader than that as well?
Yeah, and it's great to be with you, Kari. I'm glad to see Brother and Sister Soul taking a lead in raising these issues. So as Anna was saying, the pandemic's exposed the inequities that were already there and exacerbated them. And we know that the same kids who don't have access to learning are also the children of people who are the essential workers or the people who are not working at all now and who are at risk of losing their homes, losing because they don't have jobs now and may not even be able to get to eat. So the situation is dire. There's no way to put a good spin on this. In education, what we know is even before the pandemic, our schools, public schools, were a critical part of the social safety net for kids, right? The one place where they're guaranteed a meal, maybe two. The one place where they're guaranteed heat in the winter, where they're guaranteed some supervision. When that falls apart, because schools are not open, you have lots and lots of kids who are vulnerable. And we're seeing that vulnerability manifest in lots of ways. We are experiencing a mental health crisis now across the country among children and adults who are stressed out, who are afraid, who are depressed, who are refusing to leave their rooms. It's bad. And we don't know yet what the consequences will be to this. What I would strongly encourage all the listeners out there is the best, we can't wait for someone to save us. There's no one coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. I was reading Grace Lee Boggs, who I would strongly encourage people to read, an activist from Detroit, lived long, good, healthy life. And she really talks about resourcefulness and agency. And that's what we got to look to. I was listening to an interview today with Marcus Samuelson, the lead chef at Red Rooster. And he talked about feeding New Yorkers through the restaurant, starting with essential workers, but then it was homeless people, it was whoever got in line, and how diverse the line became. And he said it was so ironic because while people were saying, oh, everyone has left New York, everyone didn't leave New York. The rich left New York. The people who were never committed to New York left New York. New York is still there, right? The people of New York are still there. And so the people who are there are going to have to figure out how do we work together, support each other through this very challenging period that we're in.
And I think, you know, one of the things that's important as we talk about this issue is what do we mean by structural inequalities that lead towards COVID? There's nothing inherently about being Black or Latinx or Indigenous that makes you more susceptible to COVID. But if you're policed differently, if the criminal justice system treats you differently, and so you are incarcerated at a much higher level, and we know that in many states, the highest levels of COVID are in correctional facilities, then disproportionately those would be Black and brown and Indigenous people. Yeah. If you know that low wage workers are disproportionately people of color and are going to be deemed essential workers, then that's going to have a higher effect in terms of COVID. if you know that low-income people have to ride public transport and in turn can't have 6 feet of distance during the height of COVID, again, disproportionate effect. Yeah. When you think about healthcare, again, broadly as an issue, issues like diabetes and asthma that we know are structural issues make you more susceptible. Segregated housing that makes you more susceptible, much harder to distance. And so those are systemic conditions that are put in place because of policies, and the result are the increase in mortality that we're currently seeing. The other thing I wanted to follow up on is around the food point that you raised. You know, we really saw this, Pedro. We opened our doors 2 weeks after we closed our doors for programming in March to provide food for our young people, for the youth of Bro Cis and their families. And as we did that, other people in the community expressed the need for food. Now we do it every single week with 2 separate lines, one for the youth members as the children who are part of Bro Cis, and the separate is a 2-block, city block long line of general community members who are coming there every single week to feed their families, some getting online the night before we distribute food at 3 p.m. the next day. Mm-hmm. To your point, we started out just saying we were going to feed our young people, right? We're not a pantry or a food distribution center in general, but we saw a need, and so, you know, we stepped up.
I think that's very interesting, because the issue of agency, right, resourcefulness on an individual level and on a community level, right? In New York, you know, the refrigerators, the communal refrigerators that sprang up on the sidewalks, on the streets, and that it's a principle, leave something and take what you need, right? I mean, that kind of creation of alternative ways of being together, they are much more authentic to our own cultures. They are much more authentic to our own, you know, survival over centuries and decades, right? Springing up. And I think that that's very important. And, you know, it reminds me when I hear you talk about the public school, Pedro, and when you talk about Brotherhood, Sister Sol, is that there are so few institutions that are positive institutions in people's lives, right? If you think about the other types of institutions, they are either dealing with a crisis, like the health system is not a preventative, affirming health system. It's a health system for illness, right? It's a health system. And incarceration and other, but schools and libraries are some of the few institutions other than community-based organizations like Brotherhood, Sister Sol, right? That have that kind of by and for, you know, by people from the community, by our own people, for our own people. And I think in these times is that is really critical. And I want to say, you know, the foundation has been so heartened and proud to support Brotherhood, Sister Sol, because we do believe that problems and solutions live in the same place. And that's what we are saying, right? That problems and solutions live in the same place. That the architects of solutions are also those who are facing the challenges, right? So I do think that at this time, it's very important to see the imagination of solutions that have come up, right? Mm. The imagination, because that's where I think the possibility and the using of a crisis as an opportunity, right, is about. So I'm so heartened to see how Brotherhood, Sister Sol has continued to evolve. You know, you are a first responder in the community.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, I think, Anna, you know, raising a point also about local communities and New York, we all are citizens, even if Pedro's, you know, gone out to Los Angeles and has his, you know, his LA backdrop behind him. He's a son of New York. We'll always claim him. All 3 of us love this city, have worked on these issues for so long, have worked unfailingly for justice, for more equity, for more equality. And so what we know is how tough these conditions were already in New York City. And the point of today, I think, you know, as we struggle, we have to struggle. We have to go deep with the issues, not to leave us in a place of depression, but to really understand the realities so that we can also seek solutions. And so pre-COVID, the lifetime expectancy rate in Harlem was 70, and on the Upper East Side, it's 91, a mile and a half away. Pre-COVID, Manhattan had the greatest disparity of wealth of any county in America, with the top 5% at $860,000 a year, and the bottom 20% under 10,000 a year. 20% of those in Manhattan surviving on under 10,000. Pedro, you know well that 10% of New York City public school students are homeless. Over 100,000 children go to school each day not knowing where their roof will be at night when they come home. And 1/3 of all New Yorkers are in poverty or near the poverty line, nearly 3 million people. So these were already the realities in the city, things that we've all worked on and struggled on. And yet, because of COVID, 1/4 of all Black and Latinx people have lost their jobs in the city of New York, 25%. And so within New York City, what is COVID going to do to New York? How do we respond? What does reopening schools look like? To your point, Pedro, should they look different? Should the economic situation look different? You know, what is the future of New York thinking about these realities from your perspective? And maybe Pedro, you can go first.
So I think that we have to see the disruption as an opportunity in the way Anna is describing. Because as you just pointed out, Kari, we were already headed on a path that was unsustainable, that had left many people out and with bleak prospects. You know, just think about the environment. Here in LA, we got fires again, blazing, air quality bad, climate change is real. So we have so many signs that we can't just go back to the way it was. The way it was not good. The way it was not sustainable. Yes. So returning to normal is not what we should be after. We should be thinking, okay, how can things be better? How can we start to move in a different direction within our institutions like schools, but within society generally? You know, at a personal level, many of us have used the pandemic as a chance to be home with family more. So that's been the one good thing. Gardening, fortunately, I can garden. So to grow food, but we have to think at a collective level. How do we start to provide for those who are more vulnerable, who are weaker around us? How do we build support in our communities so that we can take care of each other? Because as we've seen at both the federal, the state, and the local level, we're not going to get leaders who, unfortunately, if we lived in New Zealand, it would be different. We don't live in New Zealand. We live in the USA. And I haven't seen leaders rising up to provide the kind of visionary leadership that's needed. So it's going to have to come from groups like BroSis and demonstrate, look, we can't act like we have nothing, there's nothing we could do. It's not true. You know, I pointed out in that interview in the New York Times, you know, slavery, talk about bleak times. And even during the bleakest times, there were people who were, Harry Tubman and others, leading people out of slavery. When the opportunity came, resisting, armed resistance to slavery. When slavery ended, creating schools, not for jobs, but for liberation. So we've had periods in our history where we have looked to each other for strength and for a way forward. We're entering that period now. And so rather than every person for themselves, it's got to be every person looking out for each other. That's what's going to get us through. It's going to be empathy. It's going to be collective work and cooperation that will allow us to confront and hopefully prevail over the challenges we face.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up about schools specifically from that perspective. Usually when, you know, people talk about public schools, the first word that jumps to mind is not empathy, right? There may be individual teachers who have great empathy, or principals and, you know, real, you know, kind of heroes in public education, but as systems, they're not built on empathy. You know, and you mentioned earlier kind of taking advantage also of a crisis. What should our schools look like, Pedro, going forward? Like, how should this moment force us to reorganize, reimagine our schools? I don't know anybody who's been in more schools than you. You've worked on this on a national level. How should our schools look post-COVID to respond to, yes, the pre-inequality, but also the realities that COVID has accentuated?
So I would say three things. I'd say first, they have to be more equitable, right? That is that we have to think about how to make sure we can address the needs, the non-academic needs of kids that often impact their ability to learn. So health, housing, food, et cetera. Those are the basic needs. So we have to think about child development, not just academic achievement. And we have to organize accordingly. We have to make sure that there are counselors available, social workers available, because you can't put all that on a teacher. And when we do, teachers get overwhelmed and burn out. But we also, beyond thinking about the human needs, we have to think about how do we motivate? How do we engage? How do we stimulate kids? You know, if one thing we've seen during this pandemic, parents are the teacher for a lot of kids right now. They're the ones, if the parent is not sitting with their child, making sure they get on Zoom, it's not happening for a lot of kids. But let's not just rely on Zoom. Let's get kids reading. Let's get kids playing. I got kids doing a theater production at my house right now. That's low tech, right? You don't need to rely on the computer for everything. So I think that schools need to be supportive places, but they also need to be stimulating places. It should be at the end of the day, the kids say, man, what a day. Can't wait to go back, right? That was inspiring. That was fantastic. A good education makes you want more education. That's what we should be after, is nurturing curiosity in kids so that kids become independently motivated learners, tapping into their voice, tapping into their desire to learn.
You know, I mean, it reminds me again of some of the work, you know, Bro Sis. Our liberation program is the kind of aspect of our organization where we're doing the most advanced political education of young people and training them to be, you know, change makers today. And it's a point, you know, I often make that there is no social change in this country without young people. Young people were at the forefront of the women's movement, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, anti-war movement, LGBTQ movement, every single one. You know, you think about the Freedom Riders, most of them are college students. People who are protesting on the front lines, you know, during the civil rights movement were college students. And so for our young people in the liberation program, this very issue is something that they have been tackling for the last several years, which is that there were more police personnel in our schools than there were guidance counselors and mental health providers. That the ratio was 1 guidance counselor to 400 students. And again, that was an aggregate. In some schools, it was 1 to 1,500. And so what does it mean if you have more police personnel in your school than you have guidance counselors, let alone a health worker, let alone a nurse practitioner, all the things that should be in schools. And we were making that argument, and our young people were making that argument, and they won certain battles, drawing attention to it, working with Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer and securing another $285 million from the city council to hire more. But still, I think to Anna's earlier point, the message so often fell on deaf ears. It was an add-on as opposed to a central issue. And if young people needed mental health support pre-COVID, then when our doors are fully open and young people are back in schools, all of that kind of community will be that much more necessary. And so the hope is that there's a complete reimagining of this issue, that every school has sufficient guidance counselors, mental health providers, nurse practitioners, that we're reimagining what we're doing in our schools because the old model simply was not working. And when you have 2 successive administrations celebrating a 70% graduation rate, which means hundreds of thousands of kids not graduating or at risk of failure, when that is considered success, there's clearly something fundamentally wrong with the school system in a way that's not being addressed, to your point, Pedro, by municipal leaders in terms of kind of mayors, governors, and people with the authority really to influence this. Yeah. And I want to bring you in on what Pedro said, you know, what I've said, kind of the New York City realities, what it's unearthed, what are some next steps forward, some positive steps for our community.
So I do think that, you know, when we think about how we move forward, how do we seize this opportunity? And Pedro just gave several examples, which are really about that, what you talked in the beginning, the agency, the coming together, the creating solutions that are for self, but beyond self. They're communal solutions, right? I think that this is the time. You know, I work in philanthropy and we do better. We do better and we do our best when we follow community leadership. That's philanthropy, in our opinion, is at its best when it can recognize the opportunity to partner and support that kind of leadership, that kind of authenticity, that kind of, what we say, you know, uprising of solutions. With the racial uprising that has been part of this period of COVID, one of the most powerful things, in addition to the uprising itself, and I'm going to say the historical opportunity for those of us who are not Black folk to be in the uprising, as it is our uprising in that sense of responsibility and the change that we all need. It's a overall liberation, different for different people, but a needed liberation. Mm-hmm. Has been the imagination of what's possible, the imagination that we can't decarcerate people, the imagination that there is no need for people to live in poverty, the imagination that schools can be attractive to kids, can be a center of opportunity and possibility, right, for kids. So I think that, we've been thinking about a lot in philanthropy. What is our job now? And what is the difference? We have major national elections going on. What is the difference in the occupancy of that power? And what does it represent to the lives and to the legacies of COVID, to the legacies of the centennials, legacies of slavery, of starvation of people, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that one of the most important things we can do is continue to fund by and for solutions, that we actually have to increase the funding for that, so that these emerging solutions that look like crazy ideas, could we actually do discussions and reshape, we're talking about schools, reshape schools, should philanthropy and could philanthropy fund the community response to what schools, what it looked like schools that they want to have, it made me think. I was very fortunate in São Paulo. I went to public school in São Paulo that was, and that doesn't exist anymore. The government, it was a public school, but the government, it was an experimental school. Pedro, I might look for my notes. It was a very holistic, and Kari, we had, although it wasn't called political education, it was called social studies. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. It was the understanding between my life and the structures that I live in, and the people, and how those structures existed in Brazil at the time. And so I know personally, I know the difference that schools that teach critical thinking, that schools that help you understand how the world is constructed, that schools that understand the structures of life, right? And the formation of human beings within and breaking those structures at the same time, how they are. It's a pivotal need. But I think that going forward, what we need to do is what is being done, but more of that. The creative solutions, cooperatives, new economic arrangements, new education arrangements. Look, another thing that happened with schools being closed has been the issue of childcare. The issue of childcare, just like food, right? People shouldn't have to need to go to school to eat. Kids should not need to, if I don't go to school, I don't eat. Parents and families should not have to rely on school to be able to go to work in terms of childcare, right? So you see the exposure of the lack of investment in the fundamental needs that families have, that individuals have, that communities have. So we think that, yes, even the rigidity of gender roles, that has been somewhat, there's a little bit of a conversation that, because of being at home, the home maintenance work, the socialization of kids, the cooking, the cleaning, the maintaining of life has been more shared by men and women. So it's been, those are the good things, right? And what can we do? How can we propel that forward? I do want to go back to the digital divide that Pedro was talking about in the kids. So today, in New York City, the mayor announced that they are going to put internet services in shelters. That's a beautiful thing. However, this is October 26th, right? If I'm not, that was a March event.
Yeah, what happened? Why couldn't they have done that in the summer?
I mean, in April, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's like, right? Let alone all the things that it takes. And let's be real. We reduced our staff's full-time definition to 80% because it's the minimum we could do for people to be able to cope with having to become a teacher, right? You have to become a teacher. You have to take care of, cooking at home all your meals. You are taking care of people now all the time. So I think that this is a moment where rather than not pay attention to these changes, we need to pay attention to these changes. We need to power the responses. We need to ask people, what is your imagination? What would work better for you? So from the point of view of philanthropy, I think that, there was a decent response to COVID. I need to say that philanthropy responded quickly and responded in significant ways. I believe that there has been some response to racial inequality in philanthropy's own investments. But that's not something that can happen once. It's something that needs to keep on growing and continue. But I believe that to address that, philanthropy really needs to get to fund the imagination of solutions, the practice of new solutions, the fostering that kind of thinking, fostering that kind of community leadership by saying, I believe in you, and here is some support for you to do that. So I think going forward, yes, this can be a moment that we are overwhelmed, that we are suffering, that we see what's fallen. But I agree with Pedro. Much of what has fallen is not bad to fall. It needs to fall. It needs to be exposed. It would be a mistake for us to rebuild. We need to build forward. We really need to build forward. And let me just finish by saying housing. The issue of housing, the immoral, pre-existing homelessness situation and the policies around homelessness in New York City. Now, there's an opportunity in the city because, as you said, those who are truly committed to the city are in the city, right? And the city has had enormous changes right now in the commercial occupancy, in the residential occupancy, and it is the time to really look at how do we do the city in a way that people that live here have a home here. So I do think that the election is very important, but no matter what the result of the election is, we need to move forward these new ideas, these new policies, and we need to, more than ever, be very, I'm going to say, positively disciplined in the goals that we want to achieve.
And I think we also, to pick up on some of those themes, we need to think big. And I want to bring Pedro into this after this. But, when you think about what we don't teach in our schools and what you talked about in terms of your upbringing, Anna, the fact that we do not, as a society, demand and have the teaching of ethics, of political education, of what it means to be an engaged citizen, of critical thinking. That is not the model of so many of our schools, but instead standardized tests with a box to fill in, and not that kind of critical analysis is something that has to be changed. When you talk about the mayor announcing to much fanfare that he's going to bring, Wi-Fi and digital connections into homeless shelters. Well, one, that was announced at the beginning of COVID to distribute 300,000 laptops to young people in need. And it took weeks for that to get in their hands. But first, why are we putting that in shelters? Why aren't we building housing, to your point, for low-income people so that nobody needs to live in a shelter? The idea that that is the Band-Aid on the solution, as opposed to really building, the housing that people need. And, we always focus on these are decisions by government and municipalities. Philanthropy can only do so much when you talk about these kind of issues of housing in New York, that you could cure homelessness in America or near cure it for the same cost as building one aircraft carrier, right? And this has been now reported widely. That's a choice of successive administrations, whether it's Congress, whether it's presidents, et cetera, to build aircraft carriers instead of giving everybody in this country a home. That's a choice. And so I think we have to reimagine choices going forward. And I think some of that is what these kind of mass protests are about, the mass protests about racial justice, commenting on, responding to, revolting against, long-standing racial inequality and the prejudice that Black people face and the violence from police, from the system, and now kind of reimagining the conversation, I think, in a different way. And so, Pedro, I'm wondering, what you think about these mass protests, where they're taking us, where does this go next? Picking up on some of the themes that, Anna has brought into the conversation.
So on the one hand, I'm inspired by them. I know when we participated out here in LA, it was such a good feeling to see so many people out. It was the first time many of us had come out of our homes and been out together. So it felt good. But I also know that protests are not sustainable either. People get tired. You can't go every day. You got other things you have to do. Hopefully you got to work and go to school. So we need to think about organizing in a multifaceted way. We got a lot of educational work to do. You look at the people who either are not going to vote or who think Trump and Biden are equivalent, the people who are easily manipulated by fake news and conspiracy theories. If anything, this period has exposed how poorly educated Americans are. So organizing has to include a kind of a popular approach to educating people and urging people to be informed. You can't really participate in a modern democracy as an ignorant person. I was talking to a young person in my neighborhood who said he wasn't voting because he wanted to serve on the jury, a jury duty. And I was like, are you serious? And I, it was so clear that he was so alienated from the whole process that he was more concerned about jury duty than about what's at stake in this election. So we have a lot of work to do to educate people. A lot of people, the murder of George Floyd, captured on camera, exposed the violence of the system. But the violence of the system has many forms. It's not always a policeman on your neck. It's being evicted into the cold in the winter because you can't pay the bill and there's been no provision. It's having the lights cut off because you can't pay the bills. It's drinking lead in the water in Flint. Violence takes many forms, and structural violence of the kind that Anna was talking about kills more people than police violence.
Yes.
So we have to recognize that the problems are of a large and significant nature, that they require a sustained response, but most of all, they require an ability to imagine a different future for us. And I can't say that enough, because if you can't imagine it, you can't get there. We have accepted, I saw a report in the New York Times, which I read all the time anyway, even though I'm not in New York, billionaires who are like Trump trying to say they're going to leave and move to Florida. The billionaires were killing New York. They were literally killing New York because they buy up property that they don't even live in, displace more people. And that's been going on for years. So this, maybe their absence is a time for renewal, a time for reviving the city with a different vision. Let's reclaim public transportation, keep it safe, keep it clean, keep it affordable. Let's find ways to build back the social infrastructure of the city so that children are supported, so that our parks are places that all people can use and benefit. We need a different vision. And again, you can't look to the politicians for it. A lot of people who talk progressive, but they don't even, have a vision. I mean, think about, anyway, I don't even want to.
No, I understand. I understand what you're saying. I think also, to your point, the incredible hope of the moment is also the incredible danger of the moment, because what we're talking about is not fringe change, but systemic change, right?
Yes.
I would even, take something like, public transportation and push it further. Forget it being affordable. Why isn't it free? Why can you get in your car and drive on public roads for free, but you can't get on a bus or a train for free? If you really want to talk about the environment, if you want to talk about issues of poverty. And to your point around violence and what is violence, you know, every year Martin Luther King's birthday comes around and everyone quotes his "I Have a Dream" speech. And there's so many radical comments of his and radical speeches. And, you know, one of the things he said is America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what is violence? Violence is poverty. Violence is segregation. Violence is slavery. Violence is the criminal justice system. It's exactly what violence is. It's economic exploitation of people. And if you're pushing back against that, then to your point, Pedro, you know, the knee on the neck of George Floyd is the just one small manifestation of what is representative of a much, much larger issue. And the question is how, you know, at some level, how do we tackle that? And, you know, that's a huge question. But it's also, you know, I think what a lot of people are talking about, you know, right now, I think we're at the dawn of the election coming. And, you know, I just want to raise this. It's the elephant on the Zoom. You know, it's next Tuesday is the election. And just for sake of this conversation, if we project, you know, Biden win next week, still, what is the necessary kind of work for structural change? As we're talking about, there was massive wealth inequality pre-Trump, 20 generations of structural racism, incarceration approaches at levels, you know, that you don't see anywhere in the world, a lack of healthcare for all, an environment on fire. Most likely tonight, a sixth conservative Supreme Court justice will be appointed that will call into question women's access to control over their own body and reproductive rights, likely marriage equality, and the ability for all Americans to marry who they love, restriction on healthcare and the protection of 20 million people. So move past the election. It's what is that necessary work? You know, what is that way forward? And I know, Anna, you said recently in a sentence, keep engaged, think, advocate, organize, change, you know, and those are all great words that inspire us. But I do think there's a caution in this. There's a caution and a hope. The caution is how much of this is not about the election next week, but about America foundationally. And in turn, to your point, Pedro, how we keep that momentum going, whether it's in education, whether it's in racial justice, whether it's in economic justice. And I'm wondering if you each could share some thoughts about that very large question.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, Anna, and I'll keep it brief. You know, if there's one thing we should have learned from the Obama years, is just because you win the election, even with the historic election of a Black man, it doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean you just sit back and wait for Obama to do his work. You know, there was a recent excerpt from his new book coming out, which he said, you know, the opposition he experienced from Democrats about enacting healthcare. We need to realize that the change required requires sustained movement, right? So if Biden wins, I'm unwilling to be too optimistic yet because I don't want to be too depressed if he doesn't. Then we have more work to do to make sure that the issues we care about don't get suppressed, don't get pushed to the back burner. It's going to take work at multiple levels, local, state, national levels, to begin to change the course we're on. So the work doesn't stop after the election. That's just a new starting point.
I think that it's necessary, but not sufficient. I completely agree with Pedro, and that it's necessary, but not sufficient to win the election, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think that you have some of the answers to what you were asking, Kari, which is there's a series of policies in all areas of life that need to be moved forward. They need to be moved forward at the federal level, at the state level, at the regional level, at the local level. So if we can make it practical, what Pedro is saying, the work doesn't stop. We vote, hopefully opportunities for a shift occurs. I want to be risky there, Pedro. I'm going to counterbalance that, you know, because I figure that if it doesn't happen, I'll be disappointed just as much. But I want to make it happen, you know, as a citizen, as a person, individual, not in my job, I cannot have an opinion about this, but as an individual, I want to see that happen, like I know you do too. And But the vote is one action. That's November 3rd, or anyone voting now or voting by mail. And we need to continue the actions that come after, right? So what is the local engagement that I'm gonna have? It could be that I'm engaged in my school. I'm part of I'm a parent there and I wanna be engaged in that transformation. Or it could be that I am working with food issues or eviction issues or housing issues or electing, you know, considering running for office or running for my local PTA or the, you know, the city council or the, you know, the representative group in my neighborhood. So that kind of engagement, we really need to move on, continue moving on. You're totally right. From a moment, right? The assassination of George Floyd was a moment that became a movement. And now we need to find ways at all levels to mainstream that into policies, into values, into economic changes, into, you know, they really need to be mainstream. Let me just say, you're talking about transportation, free transportation. We are talking about housing for all, affordable housing for all. We are talking about, there's been discussions about universal basic incomes. There have been discussions about truly paying people living wages, not poverty wages. This is the moment. The tax code shifts that have to happen. I'm going to say the notion of caretaking and socialization of kids and caretaking of older people and others, that notion needs to be changed, that investments and shifts need to happen there. So there's an, culture, you know, cultural institutions, the funding and support of our community-based and authentic rooted institutions in communities of color. And that all of that, this is an opportunity to shift that. You know, this is an opportunity to demand in our local, in our cities, in our states, that budgets be analyzed with a racial lens, with a gender lens, with an, you know, the geographical lens, so that we really understand and we really vote and we really challenge how the resources in our communities are happening. So I think this is the moment to follow these routes, you know, and this is the moment, as Pedro said, to really, and you said about thinking big, is the imagination of justice, the imagination of equity, the daring to imagine and to agree on that so that we can move there. So even that, right, that's a form of liberation, the liberation of our imagination, to be able to imagine that, to be able to free even our minds, even of what's possible, even what is. I mean, I know that I think of justice living in the basis of these structures of injustice. I don't even know what justice could be if it were imagined in another context, you know? But we will never know if we don't dare to imagine now and break what we can break now.
Sorry, go ahead, Pedro.
I'll be real brief. So just before I left New York, I was involved in trying to create a task force about Rikers Island. And yes, we were trying to say, look, we need this place, a torture chamber. You got almost 40% of people have mental illness. Rikers should be a university. Rikers should be a mental health hospital. Rikers should be doing job training. Rikers should be a model for how to support people. And with progressive leadership in the city, what happened? Nothing. So we need to demand more, because too often we have leaders that don't have that kind of imagination that we just heard Anna describe. And we can do this. We should stop. Let's not believe that we are weak. We're stronger than we sometimes realize.
And let me just say that we're trying to close Rikers. We're trying to decarcerate people. We're trying to create an intermediary stage, I would say, with humanity and investment in people. You know, that job is not done. And you're totally right, Pedro. Could we have imagined that before? No. But that imagination came originally from people who have been incarcerated at Rikers, very powerful, long line of struggle in Black liberation politics, really with that kind of vision taking place. And then to hold in another way. So everything's possible. You are right. We need to think of that, and we need to understand that we're strong enough to make it happen.
So I want to close this conversation where we began. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that this kind of framing of this time being a cracking open, a revealing in a certain way of injustice, of inequity, of inequality in this country. But of course, that's only the revealing to some. You know, many of us who have dealt with these issues, who come from people who have been oppressed, who are facing economic oppression every day and racial oppression every day, people have, of course, been aware, did not need a revealing, did not need a reckoning. And so the hope is that this time, to both your point of reimagining justice, Anna, Pedro, to taking advantage of the moment, that those who have been organizing and protesting and advocating will feel inspired to keep doing that work that we've been doing since the founding of this country. I think the revealing and the cracking open is for many who were hidden from this, from their own ignorance, from turning their eye, from refusing to see this. And I think the hope going forward, so many of the folks attending the Zoom this evening are here in New York City, is that never again can folks act as if they don't know that 1/3 of all New Yorkers live in poverty, that our schools are as they are, that so many New Yorkers are hungry, 1.5 million New Yorkers. And that as a city, and to Pedro's point, as states and as a country, but as a city here, that we really use this moment to completely transform what this city looks like. And that cracking open, it's never put back together, but that what has been revealed is something that I think changes how we operate as a city, changes who gets the term progressive, Pedro, right? People cannot claim that term if they do not have deeply progressive, humane policies. Then they are not a progressive. Then they are not somebody who really believes in justice, you know, and inequity. This is a much, much longer conversation. We could talk all evening. We could do this again tomorrow, but I want to be cognizant of both of your times. And I want to thank you both so much for your thoughts, for all of the work you both do, for your contributions for many, many years to the issues we talked about today, and for your continued leadership on issues of justice and on issues of equity. We're going to need you two and many more part of this conversation going forward. So I want to thank you both for joining us. I want to thank everyone on the Zoom for joining the Brotherhood Sister Soul in this time of community, in this time of building connection between us. That's what this evening's about. We hope you leave inspired, informed, and ready to organize. Thank you all. Take good care.
Thanks, Kari. Thanks, Anna. Good to see you
Thank
both.
you, Pedro. Thank you, Kari.